Hey everybody, Brayden here, welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be covering a fascinating game that was played about a week ago. And this is Ivanchuk versus Jordan van Foreest. This was played in the World Team Championship. If you're watching this a while from now, this was played November 22nd, 2022. And in the World Team Championship, Ivanchuk was playing for Ukraine here. And there is some interesting stuff that happened here where I had to cover it and I had to show you guys. So let's get into the game. We're going to be looking from Ivanchuk's side, which Ivanchuk is playing with the white pieces here. And let's see how things go. So d4, d5, c4, the Queen's Gambit, and Queen's Gambit declined here. Knight c3 and c5, which is the Taraj. So the idea here is after c takes d5, e takes d5, black does get an isolated pawn at some point, but these lines are very well known and well trotted at this point, and black appears to be quite okay. In the game, knight f3 was played. Knight f6, e3, and this is to support the d4 pawn. It looks a little odd because a natural move is bishop g5, and this is also very common as well. e3 is, I think, the most common move, though. The idea here behind e3 is just to support the d4 square. So if ever there's a capture on d4, or if ever we want to capture on c5, the pawn on d5 has a harder time pushing to d4. So that's one of the big purposes behind it. a6 was played, and now there's an interesting move here, b3. So b3 is not as popular as some other moves, but it is just as good. So the most popular move here is bishop e2. This is by far the most popular move. But there's also a interesting one that is played a little bit less but has a huge win rate, and that is g3. Surprisingly, at the master database, when I looked this up, it was like 60-70% win rate. It was quite shocking how much white would win these positions, but when we look at just the sample line, it's kind of understandable. So this is a normal way to develop. This is actually all theory. Castles, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, b3, bishop e6, and bishop b2. And I think the reason why that white tends to score better is just because it's hard to get this d4 break in, and also it isn't like there's no other imbalance. It's just that there's a pawn on d5 that is potentially weak because it's isolated, and if it can't push to trade off, then white does have some rain against it. Of course, black does have activity for the pawn, that for the weakness, but that is I think the best reason I can come up with that white scores much better in these lines, at least as a way. So going back, b3 was played immediately instead. And this is, in my opinion, I think just to prevent c4. Sometimes c4 and then b5 can be played to try to secure the pawn. The problem is now if you go b5 preparing c4, now it makes sense to take on c5 because now there's no c4. Simple as that. Going back here, knight to c6 was played. Now we have bishop to b2, bishop to g4, bishop to e2, developing and just getting out of the pin. Bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, and now c takes d4. So unfortunately, white does not get the opportunity to get an isolated pawn position where it's only black with the isolated pawn. After e takes d4, now both sides have an isolated pawn. But there is an argument here. White does have the bishop pair. Not only that, but both are fianchettoed and both look quite good. So that is the idea that Ivanchuk is going for here. Bishop to b4, castles, and another interesting move. What would you play in this position? This is, I think, actually a good exercise. What do we target, and what do we do? So I think there's a lot of natural moves that could be considered, like rook c1. I think rook e1 is a little counterintuitive, just because there's a pin you're creating if you put a rook there. But the move that was played is knight a4. And I think this is really fascinating because it all has to do with this move a6, believe it or not. So the point here is knight c5 might be coming. And if bishop takes, pawn takes, white is pretty happy about that because now there's no more isolated pawn. They can protect it with something like a3, b4. Let's actually just make some moves. Like h6 looks like a semi-normal one here. We could see some like a3, b4 happening. This pawn is isolated and both bishops are phenomenal. So this would be something that I'm sure white would be happy to see. Instead, other than that, if the knight gets to c5, then, well, after this a6 move, you don't really want to play b6 because, well, then it feels like maybe these pawns could be weak at some point. And if you play b6 as well, this knight on c6 becomes a lot less stable. So those are all the reasons behind the move. Rook to e8 was played. Knight to c5. b6 provoking the move. And the idea here is that we're just going to go back to d3. And although we took 3 moves to make this maneuver, the knight is great on d3. It can jump to e5 now, as the knight on c3 kind of didn't have much to do other than attacking d5. At least here there's more prospects in the future. And also now the c6 knight is a bit more vulnerable to attack. In this position, bishop to d6 was played. This was mainly to kind of deter ideas of knight e5. Rook to c1, rook to c8, rook to e1, natural moves, knight e4. You could also just take on e1. That's also completely fine. Knight e4 is interesting. Rook e2, queen d7, and rook ec2. So trying to take advantage of the now slightly weakened c-file because of this b6 move. So as we can see, this is what strong players do. They make some sort of very small, maybe even not even noticeable problems on one side of the board, and all of a sudden it's a lot of pressure. So knight f6 was played, but there's actually a better move, knight b4, which is just aiming to liquidate the position. After knight takes b4, bishop takes b4, things would probably just come off. There's this interesting move, queen d3, but ultimately, yeah, again, everything just kind of comes off, and g3. And you can maybe try to argue that white's slightly better because of the bishop pair, but computer says it's equal, so that's one thing to note. And there is a bishop pair, so it's understandable that it might just be a little bit annoying. Anyways, knight f6 was played instead. And we see g3 to fianchetto the bishops, because maybe the bishop goes back to g2 here, and there's some interesting maneuvers we'll see because of that. g6, fianchettoing as well. It's also a good move to get luft, right? Because g3 and g6, now there's luft for both of the kings. If there's any checks on the back rank, it won't be a mate. Bishop to g2 now. Rook to c7. And this is not really the right approach. A better move, again, is just knight b4, accepting that this is the best shot. And there's an interesting move, knight e5, that should be mentioned. Queen f5, rook takes c8, rook takes c8, rook takes c8, queen takes, queen f3, bishop b7, and a3. And yeah, like the line would go like something like queen c2, queen c3. This was just a line that popped up during the analysis that I thought I would mention here. But going back into the important stuff, yeah, this knight b4 pops up in a lot of these positions. And after rook c7, there starts to be problems after queen f1. Which is a very, very impressive move. And the idea is just to take advantage of the fact that you can't really take over the c-file as black. There's always bishop h3 problems, and c8 will be covered. So rook e7 was played, which was a mistake. But actually here, there's a really interesting move. maybe I'm saying interesting too much, but it's really fascinating. This move, queen c8, which looks a little bit pointless because bishop h3 will kick it. But actually, we're very happy that the queen's on b7, surprisingly. This fianchettoed queen, as I like to say, is actually performing a perfect job defending all of the potential weaknesses on this side of the board. So there's actually kind of no problems for black. I mean, it's maybe a little uncomfortable, but there's no direct threats at the moment. So that's pretty important. But instead, rook e7 was played, and now bishop h3 comes, and the queen can't get to its ideal square on b7, which is kind of a big deal here. Queen e8 was played, and now knight e5, which I thought was worthy of an exclam, just because it looks like there's just a lot of problems with taking, but in reality there's not. So after knight takes e5, bishop takes e5 makes a little bit less sense to me. I think knight takes e5 is the more natural move here. Knight takes e5, d takes e5, rook takes c2. Just simply rook takes c2, bishop takes e5, takes, and rook c8. So the idea is that the c file ends up coming in full control here, and if queen takes c8, bishop takes c8, we're just up a queen for a rook. Ivanchuk would win this blindfolded. So knight b8 was played instead here, but that doesn't really feel like it's that good of a move, just because it's retreating, and because you can't take on e5, and you can't really hold everything, because right now there's a threat of knight takes d6 or rook takes d6, which is a big problem. So it's hard to find a reasonable choice. Knight b8, after this move, there is a really shocking one, actually, and it's the move bishop a3, which is worthy of another exclam. And the idea here is that you can't take. It's as simple as that. If you try taking on a3, there's always rook takes c7, right? And if bishop takes c1, it's important to note that takes on e7. Oh, actually, no, maybe rook c8 is actually just better. My apologies. Rook c8 is definitely just better, where we're going to be able to take on e8 next move. So here queen d8 was played to defend the bishop. And now the move of the game, the one that maybe people know this one for, the move knight d7, which is really fascinating. Its only purpose is just to destroy the coordination of every single piece for black. This move is totally winning. It's the best move by a long shot, actually. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces that can take this knight, and none of them really should. The problem is if you take it with one of the knights here, then bishop takes on d6, and we're attacking everything here. If rook takes c2, there's bishop takes e7 at the very least. We could also consider rook takes c2, and I think this is actually totally fine as well. A line I like is even maybe something like bishop takes e7, where if rook takes c1, bishop takes d8, rook takes f1, bishop takes f1, for example. And this does look like a good potential endgame, but of course I think leaving the rooks on might even still be smarter here with rook takes c2. Because after the rook moves, we're just going to go queen c1 and rook c8. And that's really hard to prevent, actually. So this does look like a completely winning position, despite the two bishops versus the two knights looking a little promising, in all honesty. So knight to d7, you can't take with either of the knights because that's a huge problem. If you can't take with either of the knights, then what do you do? So we have to try something else here. We have to try rook takes. And that's actually what was played in the game. So before we get into that, we should probably also lastly look at rook takes c2. But after rook takes c2, there's actually knight takes f6 with check, king g7, rook takes c2, and you can take on a3, and you can take on f6, but neither are really that great. So bishop takes a3, for example. There's rook c8 problems again. Queen takes c8, knight h5 check. We should throw that one in. And if the piece moves like queen d6 here, then there's knight e8 check. And after rook takes, then we're just up in exchange. Let alone like being, like the knight, let alone the knight being bad, and like the bishop being, the bishop's fine here, but it's not performing the best functions in the position. But that's actually a huge problem there. And so they can't really take on a3. Going back in the line here, we have to keep going through it, I think. Lastly, I don't really think king takes is the most appetizing move. We could look at moves like bishop takes d6, but I think also even like bishop c1 looks quite promising, with rook c8 still as a threat. Of course, rook c7 should be played. And here, one last move to look at is rook c7, where rook takes c7, bishop takes c7, knight g4. And this doesn't look like it's anything, but it actually is. So knight c6 developing, queen takes a6, we were pretty happy about. But if they don't develop here, we have the move queen c1, and we're just getting in on the king side, actually. And a move like h5 is not really tempting, because this d5 pawn's probably just going to fall after some bishop g2. So in the d4 pawn, it doesn't even matter if it were to fall or not, because with the two bishops, there's a considerable amount of king safety problems for black. So a lot of like abstract lines that don't even look obvious, but are totally winning for white in every single variation you look at, which is really shocking. And I'm still trying to get my mind around it. I looked at this and analyzed it for a while before I started covering it for you guys, and it's still like it's just a shocking move. So let's go on with the game. Rook e takes d7, bishop takes d6. You can't take on d6 because we take on c7, so rook takes c2, rook takes c2, rook takes d6, and rook c8. And now this is a winning amount of material. But now things actually go astray. Not immediately, but we're going to see that there's a winning position doesn't always mean that the game's over. And we'll see that shown here. So queen takes a6 was played, knight takes d4, king to g2, king g7, b4, knight c2, queen a4, knight e1 check, king f1, knight f3, queen to d1 now, knight e5, queen to d4, just centralizing the queen at this point, knight f3 and queen f4. I thought an interesting line was queen c3, where the idea is if knight g5, then f3, and just trying to restrict the knights at least a little bit. Because the big pro is a4, a5, and these knights are very, very annoying somehow. So I wanted to prevent them from moving further, and I thought queen c3 and f3 might have been a good way to do that. And we're not really scared of like moves like d4, because we can just move to d3. It's not fun because our queen's the one blockading, but I thought this was maybe a chance. Everything is still winning. Queen f4, knight e4, and now things get a little bit more difficult. King g2 was played because queen takes f3, knight d2 check, wins the queen, and all of a sudden black is winning in this position. So king g2 was played, knight e1 check, king f1, now knight d3, queen e3, knight d takes f2, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, black's getting some activity, and it's very annoying. The king doesn't feel 100% safe. This should still be winning for white, but there's a lot of work to do regardless. Queen d4 check, king g8, a4. I thought an interesting move was bishop b7. Knight g4 king g2. And we can't take on d5 yet, but we want to. And the reason why we can't is if h5, for example, bishop takes d5, this is a problem because there's always knight e3 check in the air. So rook takes d5, there would be knight e3 check. But maybe you can argue that queen takes e4 is something here. Again, queen takes d5 would be a huge mistake just because of knight e3 here, winning the queen. So a4 was played instead. And rook c6, bishop to a6, trying to get to the defense. Rook c1 check, king g2, and now knight g4. And there's also a better maybe move. The engine says it's better here, rook d1. The idea of rook d1 is black's going to play rook d2 next, and then there's just going to be problems along the second rank, and it just creates a little bit of counterplay. Objectively, I believe this is still losing for black here, but there's work to be done for white to finish this game off. Instead, after knight g4, which is a good move still, because the idea of knight g4 here is that now if queen takes d5, there's knight e3 check, winning the queen. So it's just a tactical way to defend the d5 pawn. Ivanchuk ended up blundering here, and the game was over, which was really unfortunate. And it's an easy move to miss. It's a very, very easy move to think works and doesn't. So what's the strategic goal of white in this position? And I ask that to mislead you. So it's not going to be a5. A5 does feel strategically like maybe it's a good idea because you want to push your passed pawns. But I think another strategic idea is to trade off some of the pieces when you have like a material balance that might favor you. So like a queen versus a rook and knight generally should favor the queen. But here, trading the knight on e4 with the move bishop d3, even though it looks natural and looks like it is perfectly fine, it's actually losing by force. The problem is, what moves can the queen make after the simple move rook to d1? The queen cannot move. This is a problem because one of the knights will go to f2 next, and rook takes d3 is unstoppable. All of a sudden, it's a rook and two knights versus a queen, and that material imbalance favors black. So rook d1, and again, we want to be able to protect the bishop and be able to take next move, but we can't move the queen anywhere that actually protects the bishop. Not here, 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 or here. Because queen takes d5, again, tactically runs into the problem of knight e3. So after rook to d1 here, a5 was played, but rook d2 check, king g1, knight e to f2, and now knight h3 check, king f1. If the king went to the corner, it would be checkmate. King f1 here, knight e3 check, and this wins the queen. Rook d1 check was thrown in. The idea is after king e2, knight takes d5, king takes d1, there's knight f2 check. So this just forces a trade. So instead of playing knight takes d5 immediately, there's no knight f2 winning the bishop. And that just makes the job a lot simpler. Rook d1 check, king e2. Once these pieces come off, once this trade occurs, it's a lot easier to stop this pawn. And if you stop this pawn with the knight, then you just have free range on or free reign on this side of the board. Actually, another idea is just to bring the king over, because the knight can defend for the time being against the pawn promoting. And then when you win the pawn, you just go to the king side and mop up here. So after knight takes d3, Ivanchuk resigned, which is really unfortunate. There were some really cool moves here that I think Vasil played at the start. But unfortunately, even though he was mainly just in the driver's seat, even with like some technique that like the engine didn't prefer. I'm not gonna say sloppy technique because he's a master, I'm not. So I gotta respect my masters. even with some moves that maybe weren't as accurate, felt like Vasil was in the driver's seat for the most part here until this bishop d3 and missing rook d1, which is a very easy move to miss, noticing that the queen can't really move and knight f2 is coming. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this game, and I will see you guys in the next analysis video. So have a good one, and we'll see you then. Bye bye.